Oh, I guess I should turn this on. Is this how we know that we're on? It'll come back to life. Maybe. All right, you're on.
Okay. Welcome to the Friday Transportation Seminar at Portland State University. My name is Leming Wang. I'm co-hosting this seminar this quarter with Professor Chris Monsieur. He's not here with us today. Today we are very pleased to have one of our own, John Makler, to give a talk on the transportation seminar. John is a research faculty with civil engineering department here at Portland State. Today we'll talk about the joy of web-based geospatial transit performance data archive. Okay, with that, I'll give the floor to John.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. We'll try to have a little fun today with a culinary theme to make light of a technical subject, to keep you engaged and have a good time. Thank you for the introduction. It's nice to be able to give a talk about 100 yards from your own office. I am going to walk you through today a project that we have been engaged in with a number of partners in our region. And before I get into that, I have two sort of corollary slides before we get into the substance. The first is some serious business. I told my daughter that I'd be on TV today. So this is for her sake. So happy Valentine's Day, Lily. This will live on forever on the internet. I'm very happy about that. Okay, the second thing I want to get to is I want to acknowledge that the team attribute of this project really can't be understated. Here at Portland State University, we have Morgan Harvey as our developer for this project and Dr. Kristen Tufte as our data architect. There are really three talks that one could give about this project, and you're going to get probably the least interesting. But it's a transportation seminar, so you're getting the transportation talk. The data science talk that Dr. Tufte could give would fascinate her colleagues in computer science and in sort of the big data field and the smart cities field. One colleague of mine from IBM said the most important person to have on your team is a data scientist, and we have a very good one. So you get Tufte to give you your talk if you're interested in the data science, but that would be a different seminar. The other talk is one that Morgan could give about the development of this web-based tool. I don't understand anything that Morgan does, and so if you ask me questions, I'll make Morgan answer them. But the real most interesting breakthroughs in this project happened in the software development. So that would also be an extremely interesting talk for you to hear if that's what you're doing. But this is the transportation seminar, so you get boring old me. I would also like to acknowledge Steve Collis from TriMet, the Service and Performance Analysis Manager. Steve is an incredible asset to our region. He is part of TriMet's willingness to share their data, to help pose the questions that interest TriMet, that challenge us as researchers to develop research tools and techniques and methods and research products that serve the region well. We really wouldn't have this project without Steve's imagination and vision for it. And that's also made possible. I don't have a logo here for it, but the funding for this project comes both from OTREC, from our research center that's based here at Portland State, but also from Metro, which uses some of its federal funds to implement and plan for intelligent transportation systems in the region. And that group at Metro Transport Committee chose to allocate some of their funding for the ongoing maintenance and enhancement of our data archive here at Portland State. And so obviously this project doesn't happen with all of them. So with those two prefatory slides, I want to get to the talk itself. Every good research project has a literature review, and so here is your oral literature review. The field of using or doing GIS, Geographic Information Systems, in transit is one that I didn't know much about before a little bit more than a year ago. And there is, not surprisingly, a lot of fascinating work happening out there, a field in which this project joined. The Center for Urban Transportation Research at the University of South Florida has been hosting a biennial conference about GIS and transit since 2009. If this topic interests you, I strongly encourage you to go to their website. They have the conference proceedings from the 09, 11, and just this fall 2013 conference. And any facet of using GIS in transit, whether you are the geographer or the cartographer who's interested in transit applications, or you are the transit fiend or researcher and you want to learn more about how people map transit data, The conference proceedings are really valuable. At the latest conference that I attended, the term accessibility stood out in the presentations and papers that were given in two senses. One, physical accessibility, people with different physical abilities and how they access and use transit service. So agencies are relying heavily on GIS tools, both offline and online, to provide customers with information about which stops or which services are accessible and which aren't. And there's some very interesting work in that area. Also, in the more planning sense of accessibility, how, can you get from point A to point B? I want to note a research group at the University of Minnesota. They call themselves the Accessibility Observatory, and they're doing some fascinating work overlaying transit service data with demographic data. Like, where do you have concentrations of low-income populations or minority populations? And by linking that with transit data, the research is allowing us to overlay not just where certain populations live, but what opportunities they have to use transit to get places. Who lives within a 20-minute or 40-minute transit commute of a job center? Or what population can access jobs within a certain distance? So that work at University of Minnesota is very appealing to me as a planner. In general, the topic that we're going to touch on today, the emergence of standardized open data, has opened all kinds of doors. Oregon State and ODOT have been partnering on a research project in Oregon to collect the data for all of the different transit operators around the state. Today we'll be focusing on TriMet, which is unique among operators in Oregon. But David Porter at Oregon State has been working on a project for ODOT to collect this kind of data that I'll be discussing for other transit operators around the state. So if you're interested in rural or small transit services, you in the room or you out there on the web, that's a really interesting project that I think is reaching its conclusion. I was also very impressed to learn about a project at SUNY Albany. They've developed a tool for incorporating this service data, and they have, I think, 200 different transit agencies that you can go and you can see visualizations, maps of transit service. And that's something you couldn't do 2 years ago, so that's very exciting. And finally, our colleague at the University of Utah, Stephen Farber, has taken the concept of travel time reliability, which some of you have heard about presented here in this seminar, often in the context of highway performance, and he's using that reliability concept on transit networks and the reliability at different times of day to get from point A to point B. Some really interesting work going on there. So that's your literature review presented orally. If this is a topic that interests you, there's so much interesting work, and what you're going to get from me is just one tiny little sliver of it. And I want to pay adequate respect to the other people who are doing great work in this field. So why did our colleague at TriMet approach us? Why, to me, is always the most interesting question in a research or planning context. Why are we doing this? Why are we not doing other things? For a public agency like TriMet, which you generally hear about in the news because of how little money they have or how stretched thin they are, the decisions that they have to make about the allocation of resources are crucial. There's plenty of data. TriMet is sitting on loads and loads and loads of data, as I'll describe. But some of that data is harder to use in a decision-making format when it's in tabular form than when it's in a visual form like a map or a graph. When you're taking data to a board or to a committee of senior managers in a tabular format, you face those obstacles. So one of the most important motivations for this project is to take the incredible volume of data that TriMet has been committed to collecting for years and years and try to make it available in a format that is more conducive to informed decision making. It's not to say that the decision making before this tool wasn't informed, but the provision of data in a visual format and maps can help make better decisions. Another issue that lots of agencies face, just given staffing constraints, is that lots of people, many of them students, like to get their hands on data and run some little analysis for a project or do some little thing here. And you call someone up, like Steve, and you say, can you export me this data? And Steve puts aside the work that he's been doing because he's committed and he likes students and he does an hour of work for you. When you create an archive like this, it makes that kind of data available, whether it's students or staff or advocates or members of the public, a neighborhood association. But there's that democracy of data that can happen when data is available in a format that someone without a master's degree can access and use. So there's that motivation to develop intuitive tools for accessing data. And finally, and this is where I love speaking to students and researchers about this, when you have data and you put it online and you give tools, people do wonderful things with it. One of you is going to look at the data that I'm going to present today, and you will have in mind a research question that nobody else has asked. And it might not have occurred to you to ask that question until you saw that the data was there in front of you. This isn't limited to transit data. So we're extremely motivated in a university context to put this data in a format that's accessible without restrictions so that you can play with it, so that you can run your own analysis and do statistical things that I don't understand. So these are the 3 reasons why we invest resources in this project. Okay, let's go back to the culinary theme. What are we going to cook today? There are really 3 pieces of this puzzle. There's transit performance data. This has been collected for a long time. If you're not familiar with it, US DOT maintains a national transit database. Every transit agency has certain kinds of data that they're required to report. Nothing revolutionary there. Geospatial data. Nothing revolutionary there. Maps, whether they're digital or on paper, we've had maps, we do maps. Web-based. We've had the web. It's been around a few years. It's gotten better recently. You've got nifty little devices in your pocket. But the question is really, what happens when we put these together? Putting together transit performance data in a geospatial setting has been done. There's this great conference that's been around since 2009, as I mentioned. But putting all 3 things together, bus, get it? Funny, funny, not culinary. When you put these 3 things together, that's really the unique piece of what we did here today. Taking the performance data, mapping it, and putting that online. That's the trifecta. Okay, so what are the ingredients for our recipe? We have Portland State University. It's a special thing to do this kind of project in a university setting. We have access to faculty and students, and there's a brand of imagination that happens here. You have TriMet. When I gave this talk at this National Transit GIS conference, I stood up there and I said, I have Steve Collis and I have Bibiana McHugh, and you don't. And all 40 people in the room said, yeah, he's right. We have some really unique people at TriMet in Portland who are committed to sharing data. That's not always the case. I don't want to disparage another transit agency, but TriMet's commitment to sharing data and collaborating with the university is a major asset for us. And finally, we have something that we call Portal. Portal is a transportation data archive that Portland State has developed, founded by Dr. Robert Bertini about 10 years ago. We're coming up on our 10th anniversary, as a matter of fact. And that is also a unique asset. So you put these 3 ingredients together, put them in the mixing bowl, stir them up, and we see what we get. Okay, more culinary. What's the menu? You know, you open one of those fancy cooks magazines, beautiful glossy picture of this incredible meal. You know, I can do that. I can make that beautiful meal. It never turns out that way for me. But let's start off with what we want it to look like. All right, we'd love to have a map with some dots on it, right? There's lots of things that we can represent as dots. How many people rode the bus this week sometime? About half of you. Okay. So there are things about your bus stop, right? Was your bus on time? Was it crowded? Was it, you know, how many people got onto that bus stop? Attributes of the shelter, things like that. I can do that. This is a map of on-time performance. All right, super duper. That's pretty. I'd like to cook that. What if we could zoom in a little bit? What if we could look at that on-time performance in more detail? I want to look at my stop. It's not just what percentage of the time is the bus on time. How often is it early? How often is it late? How often is it on time? All right, so I want a little pie chart that I can look at. That would be nifty. Or maybe there's another attribute. How many people got on and off? So look, this is pretty. This is the first thing you see in your recipe. These are the kinds of pictures. These were relatively easy for us to create offline in Arcgis. Okay, you have the data. You can do this in a conventional software platform, no problem. But how do you put this online? Well, it's a recipe, so you prepare the ingredients. First, you take this data that's called General Transit Feed Specification. Some people still think of it as Google Transit Feed Specification, but teach yourself to say general. So you collect your GTFS data. You get that from your transit agency. You put that in a little bowl, set it aside. Okay, now you collect your automated passenger counter and your automatic vehicle location data, so you know who's getting on and off your buses, and you know where your buses are at all times. You get that data. You put that in some other mixing bowls, set it aside. Now you clean your data. That consists of calling Steve and begging him to clean the data. That's a very nice thing that TriMet does for us. He has a protocol and methodology that he follows for taking the raw data that's downloaded off of the buses each night and making sure that there aren't errors in it, fixing things, flagging things. And then he aggregates it by quarter. At this point, he warns us, be prepared for partial people. There's no purple people eaters, don't worry. But partial people. What do I mean by partial people? Well, if I look at a bus stop and I count every time a bus pulls up, how many people get on and off. All right, the 8:15 bus out here at bus stop 1, 3, 4, 5, 6, 2 people this time, 7 people that time. If I average that across every weekday and a quarter and say, what's the average number of people who get on the 8:15 bus out here at this corner, it might work out to be 4.2. But it's pretty unusual when you run a query and say, how many people get on board this bus, to come up with 4.2. Now, you might have 2.4 children, but you rarely have 4.2 people getting on a bus. So you have to be prepared in here for some unusual numerical values. Finally, when you export that performance data, your partial people, you have to export it with enough fields to support matching with that GTFS data. I'll get into that a little bit more later. But again, that's something that this entire talk would cover if it was Morgan giving the software development and Dr. Tufte giving the data science talk. So that's a whole other talk unto itself. OK, so step 1, we're into our recipe now. We've prepared our ingredients. You have to convert your GTFS to a feature class, which if you're a non-GIS person like me, sounds like wah, 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 wah. But somehow, Morgan waves his hands, and he turns text files into maps. Second, you take the pattern lines that you get out of your GTFS data. So Morgan waves his hands, and I get a thing that looks like this, right? Somewhere on the central east side of Portland, the number 6 bus comes down MLK and turns on to Hawthorne. The 14 is coming west. The 33 is coming north on Grand or McLaughlin, and it's turning on. They're all going onto Hawthorne Bridge. And from the GTFS data, I have these lovely lines, but I can't do anything with them yet. So the next thing I'm going to do, here's my little clever animation. Is it Madison? I always get this wrong. That's Madison Avenue, I think, on the west side. So that line represents one street. And that's what we get from the GTFS data. We have a line. We can't really put attributes on that line. So we know where our bus stops are. That's really easy. You can stand at your bus stop with some little GPS device, and you can get precise latitude and longitude. Now we can say where on our streets are those bus stops. And then we can break that one big black line into three orange segments. Okay? So now we have stop level segments. And so attributes that go between this stop and this stop, we can associate with this, the number of people who are on that bus, how long it took to traverse that route, other things. But we still can't figure out one of the important questions, which is how many people use the bus to travel this block of the avenue, right? And we have to get to that so that you can say, what is the sort of transit capacity of that physical space? So what Morgan was able to do was create what we're calling, we haven't trademarked this, minimum stop segments. And that's saying we know that there is a non-stop node in the network here and here. Now we can take the 3-segment orange line and turn it into a 5-segment green line. So now you can merge attributes across all 3 bus routes, the 6, the 14, and the 33, and assign those to these 3 minimum stop segments. I feel like I'm diminishing Morgan's accomplishment by doing that in so few slides. This is a major breakthrough in how we handle the data. I don't know what your skill sets are. I don't even comprehend how complicated this is, but when I went to a Transit GIS conference and presented it, people oohed and ahed like someone had won the prize on Price is Right. Okay? So that's a big deal right there. Okay. That's the cooking. Now we have our dish. Let's garnish and serve and see whether or not it looks like the pictures in the fancy Epicurious magazine. Okay? So here you go. We've got dots, just like I promised. We have different performance measures. Some of them are attributes of segments. Some of them are attributes of stops. Here we're looking at stop activity. You have a legend. Blue means not very many people got on or off at that stop. Red means lots of people did. You have a time frame. You can select TriMet characterizes its data by weekday, Saturday, and Sunday holiday. So you can pick which one you want to look at. You can pick your time of day, AM peak, midday, PM peak, late night, that sort of thing. And you can pick your quarter. As I said, we get this data aggregated from TriMet every 3 months. So you can say, I want to look at the spring. I want to look at the winter. I want to look at the fall. I want to look at this fall. I want to look at last fall. There's lots of ways for you to slice and dice that data. But I'd like to say we pretty much delivered on what that recipe looked like in the magazine, right? Dots. This is actually a little prettier in my opinion. You can do other things. So like I said, it'd be nice if you could zoom in on your bus stop and get little pie charts of things. Here's a bus stop. Where are we? We're right around we're on campus, Lincoln and 4th down here. So here's a bus stop. It's served by 2 routes. You can see the 17 and the 43. And at this bus stop, during the AM peak on a weekday, which is about a 2-hour window, you can see that most of the people who use this bus stop are getting off the bus, and very few are getting on the bus, which in an AM peak tells you this is a destination. If you went out and looked in maybe more of a neighborhood location, you might expect the pie chart to be overwhelmingly green. Here's one where we overlay some of the segment attributes with some of the stop attributes. So you can still see dots. And in this case, this dot over here near the Hollywood Transit Center, we were looking very closely at on-time performance. So big arguments here about what color represents which type of performance. So on-time seems like a good thing. In transportation, good things are usually green. So this bus seems to be on time about 50% of the time. For TriMet, on-time is defined as between 1 minute early and 5 minutes late. So if the bus is 4 minutes and 59 seconds late, it's on time. Keep that in mind next time you call the customer service line. Now, how many buses are late? Late seems to be red. Red is bad, right? Late is bad. So I don't know, what does that look like? A sixth or something in there of the time this bus, the 77 to Montgomery Park, is late, and about a quarter of the time, maybe 30%, it's early. Blue, early, is early better than late? Is it worse? So, I mean, you can enter into this debate. We can spend the entire Q&A period deciding what color early and late and on time should be, and I bet there'll be conferences on this next year. Okay, here's another example of putting the stop level data and the segment level data together. Again, you have stops. You can see that we're looking at stop activity. So in this location, it's pretty low. But we're also looking at load. So if you know how many people, the bus starts with 0 people on it, right? Pulls out of the garage. A couple people get on. Some people get off. It's a mass balance question. How many people are on the bus at any given time? And if you have multiple buses on one route, like I did with my little orange and green and black lines, then you can get to how many people are on the bus. You can also, one of our recent additions, it's not even on the slide, is utilize capacity. How busy is the bus, or how crowded are buses on this segment during this period of time? You can imagine someone at TriMet saying, I'd love to see a map of all the segments where the crowding is severe during the morning rush hour or the PM rush hour, right? So, nice combination of dots and lines on this map. Let's get to dessert. Next steps. We haven't gotten to dessert. I didn't cook that. I forgot. I was so busy making dinner. So there's a couple of things that I would call cartographic refinements. One of the obstacles that we're facing is if you have a one-way street, life is simple. There's one line. It has attributes. If you have a two-way street, right now, those lines are on top of each other. They're not aggregated, but one is blocking the other one. So we just have to figure out how to tell it, move this a couple pixels over here, move this a couple pixels over there, which is, again, is vastly diminishing what Mr. Harvey can do because it's not always move it right, move it left, move it up, move it down. Complicated operation. That's one of our next things. The other thing is to make the symbology more interesting. Is an early bus blue? Should the dot be this color, this shape? How can you add more information as a non-cartographer? I end up, making things up. What would be a meaningful symbology when you're trying to represent these things on a map? Again, going back to the fact that the purpose of this whole project is to provide useful, visualized data to enhance decision making. One of the other things is data visualizations. On the highway archive that we've had in place for 10 years, there are lots of functions for graphing and plotting data, downloading CSV text files so that you can then go play with the data yourself in your own statistical package or Excel, make your own graphs, what have you. So that's another function that we're going to be working on adding here to our application. The ability to download. Again, one of our goals, one of our objectives for this project, the reason why, was to enable yourselves to download the data and use it for your own purposes so that you don't have to call TriMet staff and use their time. So adding data download functionality is an important goal for us. And finally, something that I have in mind that's very important to staff at agencies like TriMet is non-temporal queries. I showed you that we have a lot of queries where you can go in and you can say, I want weekday, I want AM peak. What if you wanted to find something, regardless of when it happens, but you want to see it in a map? The example I used earlier was bus crowding. What if you wanted to say, just show me a map of all of the locations where on-time performance is less than 85%? You know, these are places where you want to look. What if you want to see locations where stop activity is particularly high? What if you got to the point where you could monitor more sophisticated measures and you just want to see the places where the values for those measures falls in a specific range? So those would be spatial queries rather than temporal queries. And I think that'll be an exciting area of growth for us. I want to plug our new exciting website. I've mentioned Portal, which has been around for 10 years. That's the highway archive. When we developed this application and we started to think about applications that might be relevant beyond our geographic area, we felt it would be important to kind of put an overarching organization around Portal. So we have dubbed this, I don't know, activity compass. So you'll see if all you want is your highway data, don't fear. There's Portal right there with highways. But here's our transit application. We're getting ready to launch. I'll look for Morgan to nod at me. A Way in Motion application that's been developed by a research project here. So that should be online. We're keeping OnRamp. That's sort of the things you like to go to Google Labs and see what they're cooking up. OnRamp is our activities that are under development. That's a lot of student efforts. Some of you here may be involved in some of those applications. So I encourage you to come and kick the tires. I've told some people who are very savvy in the transit GIS space that I feel that what we've accomplished to this point is our first generation. We have dots and lines on a map and a couple of performance measures. The exciting steps ahead is to make those dots and lines more sophisticated, to add more measures, to add more features. And one of the best things that can happen to make that happen is to have you come and try it and then send me angry, scorching emails that say, this didn't work. This is boring. This is completely unuseful. If only you could do this function, then your thing would actually have value to me. Because each of you, as I mentioned, is going to think of a different question that you can pose and hope that this application can serve for you. So if you go to this site and you try to ask the question that you want to answer, you can tell me whether or not it worked. So I've provided our contact information for myself and the other members of the team, Dr. Tufte and Morgan Harvey, so that you can contact us. Again, send me your transportation planning questions. Send Tufte your data science questions. Complain about the code to Morgan. I don't want to hear about it. Don't tell me that you're complaining. I want to continue to believe that Morgan's coding is perfect. But really, we genuinely want to hear from you. This is a fun thing to do this kind of research that's going directly into practice. And it's very useful for us to get your feedback. That's my last slide. There's no more funny culinary references. But I would be happy to take your questions or redirect them to my colleagues. There's a microphone around here somewhere. Oh, we have a new fancy microphone. Look at that. I'd love to take your questions.
I'm Joan Shepard. My question is kind of twofold. You said the data that was coming in when you were getting it about every 3 months. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering how old the data is when it actually gets on the web, and if you guys have considered moving to something that more resembles real time.
There's a let's ask the first question is, how old is the data? Steve, can I ask you, when a quarter ends to when you're able to send the data to us could be about 2 weeks. So when new data comes out, it can be very current. And we're in the process of now working backwards. I think you have probably, I think you said 5 years of data to share with us that will work backwards to load. So eventually you'll be able to do that. So some of it could be very old. The question, really interesting question about essentially real-timing the data. The way TriMet's data architecture works, and feel free to chime in if you'd like to correct me. Each bus has this technology on board, and each night that data is downloaded to TriMet servers. Their current practice is to aggregate that and do quarterly analysis. And so our current objective is to take what they're already doing and visualize that. A really important reason is that Steve Collis provides an invaluable service in cleaning that data, finding maybe the hardware wasn't working that day, so you don't want to get a bunch of zeros into your averages. Strange things can happen in the field so that the data becomes invalid. So he catches all of those invalid data entries so that the data we get is totally reliable. It's the most reliable data set that we've worked with, I think. So the trade-off, we could theoretically get the data every night. I mean, it could just be shipped off to us. But then we would have to figure out how to present it either as raw data that you have to take with that significant grain of salt or to replicate his cleaning methodology. So for now, we're standing pat with the quarterly data, but I definitely think that's where the future is going. I also think that I would be remiss if I didn't mention that TriMet is making upgrades to its own technology and its communication technology that adds more features to that data and increases the ability for them to communicate data in real time. Okay.
This kind of expands on your question, and that is for planning purposes, is getting quarterly data probably more useful because as a planner, you're looking more at trends as opposed to individual events or events that might be outliers if you're for planning purposes.
Right. I think that's a great why question. You know, why are you asking the questions you're asking? You know, TriMet has adopted quarterly for their purposes. I think if you were embarking on a research project and you had a different question you were trying to answer, for example, on the highway side, the data is at a level of disaggregation so that you can say, I want to compare Friday, February 14th to Friday, February 7th and see how that was different. Friday, February 7th was very anomalous because of the snow. How bad was it? Okay. TriMet's data, we just know it's a weekday. We can't do the analysis. You know, on roadway counts, we often look at, well, I'm looking at some of our non-motorized researchers. You know, what are the adjustment factors for different days of the week or, you know, different times of the year when weather comes in? So you can do that kind of analysis at a very disaggregate level. The raw data exists. So if you were doing if you had a research inquiry where you wanted to get at, you know, how does ridership on this route vary when it rains? You know, do all the bicyclists leave their bikes at home and take this bus route because you wouldn't want to bike on this route in bad weather? If we archived data at the disaggregate level, it would make those inquiries possible. So again, right now, while we're just sort of helping to enhance TriMet's analysis, we're sticking with quarter. Steve, do you want to add?
Yeah, I just want to say, eventually we want to get there where we want to provide portal to daily information. But the first step was just to take our summary information that we have all our static reports for and to see if we can visually replicate this. I mean, right now we get about 500,000 rows of data a day. So we're talking about, you know, 3 to 4 million rows of data that we'd be sending over to Portal a week. So we do analyze this on a daily basis, look at what happened during the snowstorm. But the first intent of this was just to take our planning level reports and see if we can visualize these.
I think one more comment, and then I'll get to your question. Where I see this whole topic of data archives going, and when we sit around and talk about this kind of as a team, we have come from a place where you have a source of data, like, you know, automated passenger counts from buses, and you ask yourself, what can we do with this data? You know, what geographic space or what time does it cover? We have people like Dr. Krista Nordback and Sarisha Kathuri who are working on bicycle and pedestrian counts. When we get to a point where our data environment is so rich, I think we'll be able to, what a colleague calls data fusion. You'll be able to look at a particular corridor or piece of infrastructure and say, I want to know everything about this. What is the question we want to ask is, how do people and goods move? Not what do we know about from this one sensor. So when we can really understand the whole multimodal picture, that's, I think, from a research perspective and as a data archiver, that's the destination. We want to know not just how many cars are passing a point and how many passengers are on buses, which we've accomplished here, but also bicycles and pedestrians and everything else. Then you can tell the full story of how your transportation system is achieving accessibility and mobility. That's the goal. That's the big goal. That's the banquet. Thank you for you brought me back. I appreciate it, Dave.
My name is Trey Kundal, and I was just curious, with the automated passenger count and the AVL data, is that part of the GTFS specification? Do you get that independently from TriMet?
That's a great question, and that's a point that I glossed over. Think of the GTFS as the supply side data. It's really the schedule data, and it evolved because TriMet and Google wanted to work together to have this sort of standardized schedule information. That's what allows you to go on Google and get transit data, or all these other apps, PDX Bus or something. Okay, but it's all the supply side. So if you only had GTFS, and hundreds of agencies do now, which is remarkable, you can do some really fascinating service analysis, headway analysis, coverage. And as I said, if you can overlay that with things like demographic data, you can get at how does our service relate to land uses or other activities. Okay. The other data that comes off of the buses, the APCs and the AVL, that's the consumption side. So that tells you how many people got on the bus, how did the service actually run. I am obsessed with measures like productivity. FTA usually wants you to report, a transit agency to report ridership per revenue hour, right? So you can think fairly linearly about revenue miles. If you have a 1 mile section of road and you have 10 buses an hour, you had 10 revenue miles. But how many minutes? If each bus took 3 minutes to traverse that route and you had 10 buses, you had half of a revenue hour. So if you take the same ridership that rode through there in an hour, you get a different story of your transit system if you put revenue miles in the denominator as opposed to revenue hours. So combining the service that you've provided with how it actually happened, which is your AVL data, with the demand, what you're doing here is trying to combine those things. So GTFS is the supply side, and the performance data from the agency is more the demand side. And relating those is the magic. Yeah. Question here, and then here.
How portable is this? Has this been designed just to only work with TriMet's data, or could this theoretically be turned into a web app that you could then export to other agencies?
Let me answer briefly and prepare Morgan to answer in more detail. And you can also correct me because I'll make mistakes. Our intention was to develop it in an open way. The benefit of GTFS is that it's open. It's a standard. So hundreds of agencies have adopted this. In fact, we're already partnering with TriMet's help with C-Tran in Vancouver to add their data to our system. They also have GTFS on the supply side, and they have similar output of their AVL and APC data. So we're hoping to have a truly metropolitan scale here. So on the GTFS side, very open, and Morgan can talk about whether you could just plug in different agencies into our software and voila. On the demand side, it kind of goes back to those original questions. It has to do with kind of what data you have and how it arrives. But again, it comes down to having dots and lines on a map. So if you can use your GTFS to have dots and lines on a map, and then from your demand performance data, you have attributes of those dots and lines, the concept is that you can merge it. Can you talk about it a little bit more specifically from the software side?
I think the only non-portable part right now is the Arcgis stuff that I'm trying to move away from very, very quickly, because I think an import of the GTFS takes about 12 hours of processing time. And migrating that to other things to use native queries and Postgres and stuff like that would probably speed that up, and that's really the only barrier to portability is depending on an Arcgis license.
So if Portland, Maine called us up and said, we have GTFS, and we have passenger counts and AVL data in exactly the same format as TriMet, can you change your tables and we can have this? Basically. Yeah. And that's that's been the philosophy of Portal for the last 10 years is open data, open software. Did you want to go further with that question, or that's okay? Excuse me? Data and a check. Thank you, boss.
On
plays at Schiff.
Oh. Thank you, Dave.
My question was, does this data for transit have include the max and light rails, or is that something you're gonna apply in the future?
It is not limited to bus. Max is in there. Did we figure out if streetcar is in there? I think. I feel like it's included in the GTFS data, but do you guys have street?
I have streetcar ridership data,
Okay.
but I don't use their on-time performance.
Okay. So partially, yeah. Yeah.
How long has this project sort of taken you guys to develop? From like, initial idea to what we're seeing now?
Well, I think Steve had the idea in 1982, maybe 92. We started our work on this project a year ago, last January. And our goal, we developed the pictures that I showed you at the beginning of the menu. I think we got there by July, right? Because we were doing everything offline when we did our TRB paper on August 1st. So Morgan had developed, the piece that I talked about with the merging lines, I feel like that was 2 months of just wrestling with the data. And then I think it was in mid-August, it took about 2 months to develop the web tool from where we were. And then subsequently, we've done another 2 months of some refinements, additions, and we're continuing to chip away at it. So sort of those major phases, the offline thing, maybe 4 to 5 months, and then probably 2 months to develop the web tool. Yeah. Yes?
My name is Rebecca. I was wondering, you said something about like looking at the entire corridor.
Sure.
So would you be like comparing like how crowded the buses were to actual congestion on the roads?
That's a great question. And I next? No.
Need a term project?
What I'm motivated to do as a transportation planner is to understand how our infrastructure and our services meet demands. We're always interested in that. How does land use and transportation interact? That's the golden egg. What I think we have the potential to do with data is that for, 70 years we've been counting cars with more or less the same methodology. Nordbeck, would you agree? I don't know. Oh, not long after we had cars, we started counting them. And so we've made a lot of decisions based on observations of car traffic. And we make attempts to figure out how many of the vehicles are trucks or cars or buses. There's a very nascent effort to be able to count pedestrians and count bikes because, Chris, I think your language was, we've considered the numbers to be so small that they're negligible. Well, if we can actually count them, we'll know that they're not negligible. And things like the bike barometer on the Hawthorne Bridge is a great step towards that. One of the visions that Steve articulated was the ability to do a volume flow map for transit, the same as you would see for the highway performance monitoring system for highway data. That you could see volumes, you could see the transit system like a circulatory system and see where there's large throughput and see where there's small. That really helps you decide, where do you need your investments, whether it's new capital or maintenance. In an environment like transit, you're not just making system planning decisions, you're making service planning decisions. So if you think about it from the decisions, my perspective is that you think about it from the decisions that TriMet needs to make. What knobs and levers can they turn? How many buses do they put out there? What are the headways? What is the quality of service? What are the amenities at the stops? What are the things that affect ridership? To really understand how their investments yield benefits, you need to understand the whole throughput, not just what's on the bus, not just what's driving in the lane, but what's biking and walking, the whole picture. And what's exciting about this is you can get away from just being able to say there were this many cars on this road at this time. You can say this demand from point A to point B is served by a highway, 2 major arterials, and 2 minor arterials, so much bus capacity, so many bike lanes, so many bike boulevards, so many cycle tracks, so many quality sidewalks with and without curb ramps. Well, now you really understand what your total service is for providing accessibility between point A and point B. And having this kind of data, we're getting closer to being able to tell the whole story about that corridor instead of just what's happening for cars on the road. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Okay. Do you have a different? I mean, do you have an interest or a curiosity that's in a different direction? Because that's what we want to know.
I'm just curious because sometimes, like, I ride the Max, and the peak on the Max when it's the most crowded isn't the same as what's on the street.
Yeah.
So I'm just sort of curious, would there be any comparison between those?
Are your gears turning, Kristen? I mean, I could see a great animation of, the Banfield, right? I mean, I would love to test that hypothesis. If you could do a time sequence of we can do a load map of Max, by increments of time, by minute, by quarter minute, by 15 quarter hour, excuse me. Steve's going to start throwing rocks at me. I don't know. I can visualize a web page where you can see, the parallel, congestion on I-84 and the volumes on the Max service side by side. Louder.
Yeah, and Steve did that analysis.
Yeah.
Ads. We actually do ads to show ad that the TriMet carries, I forget what it was, 40% of the passengers coming in the peak hour on the Sunset Highway. And there was a Politico, I think is what it is, or PolitiFact, where they challenged us, and we actually used the portal data compared to our ABL data and was able to verify that was true.
But I can see a chart, a graph that would show when the peak on the Banfield occurs versus when the peak. Because sometimes it's not just the whole hour or a 2-hour peak period, it's down to a 15-minute increment. You could test your hypothesis that the Max peak is different from the highway peak. That would be truly a great term project. Hire her.
But I think absolutely this is the way things are going, that people want to understand what's going down the corridor, not just the cars and not just the buses, but how many bikes and how many cars and how many transit vehicles, and compare and answer exactly those questions. Yeah, I think that's the way to go. Yeah, right.
So connecting what you're saying right now back to the data side, as you're working on this, are you working on trying to align the fields and the architecture and the format amongst the TriMet data and the ODOT loop detector data and the bike ped data that's starting to come in and the weather data and the way motion data? So, because the Compass screens you flashed up, and I haven't really exported it yet, but it looked really siloed. So I was wondering if you're working on joining those up so we can get them all aligned.
I agree with everything you said. It does look siloed. It is siloed. We are still in the era of I get data from this source, and what measures can I produce about it? I have a sensor here. Tell me about here. We are not where you describe in terms of, look like your question. I have a hypothesis about this location, and I want to pull everything together. I believe that's the vision. I think that's the vision of the people in the data archive community, and I think that's where we're going. I have some frustration that we're spending time making a pretty website with siloed data when that next era feels so close, and I think that's where we're working towards, but it's not. I don't think it's today. Invite me back in 2 years, and I think it'll be a totally different picture. Yes, please.
So you asked if we're talking about aligning the data fields, and I do think, I absolutely agree with you, that's where we have to go, and I know issues with aligning timestamps and stuff, but in every data source I try and get a timestamp and a lat line and make those consistent across the data sources. And are we joining them yet? No, but is it in the vision that we always need those two fields with every type of data source we get? Yeah. I mean, and that's what we're working on. I think as much as... Yeah.
If you haven't, look at what Metro here, our MPO, has done in terms of mobility corridors. They structured their planning into something that facilitates that. This idea of a multimodal, multi-facility corridor. And that gets you from the kind of archaic notion of cut lines for HPMS to a notion of this is how, this is where people are moving. East-west here, southwest to northeast there, with these boundaries. And that gets you to, it would be valuable to know everything that's happening in this corridor. So I think that that's a good example of how an agency is going in that fused data direction. Yes, please.
Joanna Westrick. I was wondering, maybe it might be better with you guys, but has this tool been used for any specific future, changes? Could you maybe address something in a sense where this has been able to help you make a decision that would have been more difficult prior to this?
It made it easier for you to decide to keep funding us.
It just really, I think, helps identify the visualization of it. You know, before I have thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of reports, because you can imagine every trip, every stop. But this actually allows us to just say on the AMP, where is our congestion relating to the capacity, visually seeing it, rather than and seeing how it relates on to different routes on the nearby. The biggest thing, as we've mentioned before, is what we've never done before, is it's very difficult to overlay the maps where the stop and the routes come together, but that whole idea where John was talking about where, you know, we merged 3 different routes into 5 small segments to be able to put the data on top of each other. That was the biggest improvement that I saw that we were able to use this data, is actually combining, because on a highway system, when you look at a highway, everything is mileposts, right? You have milepost 3.2 and it's easy to attach data, but our data is kind of stop-based, and when you have to overlap, that was the real challenge that we had. And Morgan being able to match this information together was a huge improvement for us in analyzing data.
I think we can take another question or two. Yes?
Does your data include anything like a crash with TriMet or incidents or things like that? Is that represented visually for riders to see, like, there's something going on here, or there's a fight on the max for 2 hours, or that's just where I'm coming from?
Sure. No, the data that we get is purely the observed activity. You know, so if something happened, you know, if a bus was delayed because of a breakdown or a fight or a mechanical or anything, a snowstorm, for example, the data doesn't come across and say there was a blizzard or an ice storm today. We would just see the buses were all late, you know, or Steve just wouldn't send us that data. So I think that I know my experience on the highway side of the data is that joining that sort of in the way that Alex asked, you know, trying to come up with the piece of metadata so that you can link those. We do have some experience linking incidents on the highways, you know, by milepost and time, by overlaying weather. So there's some precedent for that, but currently we haven't done that on the transit side. I think that would relate well to the previous question. You know, what kinds of you always want to know how much of the delay is caused by chronic conditions or something episodic. Someone, I don't see him here, someone posed a great idea for a visualization in here. We've done some stuff on reliability, on-time performance. And he said, that's great, but you know, they always adjust the schedule. If they always see the buses late here, they just tweak the schedule. So on-time performance should sort of track. What would be really interesting in the long term is schedule creep. Right? If the travel time between these 2 points over the last 20 years has expanded, wouldn't it be interesting to see color-coded, you know, where it's like an inflation rate kind of thing. You know, where has the percentage change in travel time been the highest, annualized over 10 years? Maybe that would identify, hey, a new mixed-use development went in, and so there's a lot more ridership and more traffic, and so things have slowed down, or maybe they did a signal timing improvement project, and so now we can see the travel time has improved. I think the question you're asking about cause and effect is very interesting, and that goes again to where we're going in terms of fusing multiple data sources. Great question. Okay, is everybody ready to be done with seminar? Thank you all very much for your attention today.